This is the inaugural webinar series. Some of you know me. My name is Jim Gavin, and along with Niccolo Bernardi at the Center for Human Flourishing at Concordia University, we are delighted to have you join us today. So as we settle in, I invite you to take a breath and just slow it down. And in this moment, to acknowledge that Concordia is located on unceded indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters where we gather today, and Montreal has long been a meeting place for many, many Indigenous peoples. We're taking a moment in acknowledgement. So it's now my greatest pleasure to introduce Dr. Jessica Riddell. Building on the richness of the humanities and a deep commitment to educational transformation, Jessica has become one of Canada's most compelling voices on the future of higher education and human flourishing. Here's just a small taste of Jessica's work and background. She's a full professor at Bishop's University and the inaugural Stephen A. Jaroslavsky Chair of Undergraduate Teaching Excellence. She is the founder of the Hope Circuits Institute. Yay! And her work invites us to rethink universities and other organizations, not simply as structures to manage, but as ecosystems that can either constrain or nourish our capacity to flourish. Her topic today speaks to a challenge that many of us will recognize. What do we do when capable people, good intentions, and hard work still seem to get caught in systems that aren't working? Jessica brings to this question a rare combination of intellectual depth, moral clarity, and imaginative reach, drawing from Shakespearean wisdom, systems thinking, leadership in higher education. She helps us see that what looks like individual failure is often a reflection of the larger structures we are swimming in. I want to note that what especially stands out to me about Jessica is the way she brings clear-eyed honesty and hope together. She doesn't offer any easy answers or superficial optimism. Instead, she creates the conditions for collective sense-making, for asking better questions, and for imagining institutions that are more humane, more life-giving, and more responsive to the world we're all trying to build. So, hooray, hooray, please join me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Riddell. Over to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Jim, and thank you so much for the beautiful, generous, and generative introduction. I am so grateful to participate in the Center of Flourishing, and I have to share with everybody in the room how much grace and ethics of care Niccolo and Jim and the whole group have shown in the ways in which they have gathered and created community. And so I have felt the care and attentiveness and love and generosity throughout this process. And what a deep privilege to be in conversation with you all today. Anytime that somebody reads my bio, I get a little bit shy because it doesn't always reflect how I feel inside, which is messy, emergent, curious, imperfect, making sense of the world in real time, trying to find the tools necessary to metabolize this moment in our own context, this moment in our institutions, but also this moment in the world right now. It feels big and hard and difficult and fraught. And some of our institutions, our social mission institutions, are responding, and some are a little slow to respond. And so when Jim and Niccolo sort of invited me to talk to this group of diverse and restlessly interdisciplinary humans, we really thought about where and how we could land on a topic that would resonate for people in different kinds of institutional contexts, different kinds of local contexts, different community contexts. And we thought about gathering. as a way of answering or as a way of encountering that question that Jim proposed, which is what happens when good people get stuck in systems that are broken, intractable, and working the way they're designed. I say that about higher education. That is the context. Those are the ecosystems that I swim in and live in and learn in. And I'm often also harmed by that the systems are broken and that the systems are working exactly the way they're designed. And how we hold that tension, how we hold that difficulty with discernment and equanimity is really difficult, but really critical at this moment where we have to, as Jim and Niccolo and the Presencing Institute folks talk about leading into the future as it emerges. What does that mean? How do we do that? How do we look at the world clear-eyed and candidly and still be able to get out of bed in the morning? I think that is an earnest question. It's one that was the origin story of my book, Hope Circuits, where I didn't set out to write a book. As Jim said, I'm a Shakespeare scholar by training and disposition. I see the world through the lens of Shakespeare's plays. And by that, I don't mean I see the world, that is animated by characters like King Lear, although I have encountered those in real life. But what I mean is that the theater is a place where you show up as an audience member, not to be entertained, but to co-create a world that is an unfurling in real time in front of us. That the theater is a number of people in bodies, in time, in space, encountering radical change, sense making in real time, and making the world, right? We go into a Shakespeare play, and in 3 hours, a whole world unfolds, a world that has a set of conditions and values, that has governance, that has laws, that has flaws. You might not believe in witches, but if you enter the world of Macbeth, you believe in witches because they live in that universe. And so in many ways, for me, theater gives us a rehearsal space for creative futures. It gives us a way of gathering. It gives us an invitation to show up and to sense make what is this world that we're seeing unfold in front of us, but how do we participate in making it? And that's why I love Shakespeare, and that's why I love John Dewey's notion of creative democracy. Shakespeare tells us how to show up as an audience. He tells us and gives us very clear instructions in the chorus of Henry V, where he says, you are in this bare wooden O. Literally, it's 2 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon. There are no shiny stage props. There's no curtain. There's no lighting. There's no sound effects. There's a bare wooden stage. And the actors are pretending that they are in the chorus of Henry V, going to travel to the vasty fields of France. That you have to, when the actors say they can hear a horse with its hoof on the ground, you have to harness your imagination to make up for the imperfections of the actor. That's what Shakespeare teaches us or instructs us to do. And what does that have to do with the world right now and all of its complexity and hardness? I think it's an invitation for us to show up and make the world together. That's John Dewey's notion of creative democracy. He wrote this beautiful speech in 1939. He was very concerned with the rise of fascism and polarization in Europe. And he said that as soon as we treat democracy as something monolithic, as an institution that is removed from us, it starts to deteriorate. It starts to crumble in front of us, that we have to understand what he calls a creative democracy. That every single one of us in our own contexts, so in our spheres of control and our spheres of influence and our spheres of care, are creating democracy in every encounter, in every decision, in every conversation. And I love that. That puts the emphasis on us as agentic, as architects of creative futures, as folks who are making democracy in real time as it emerges and unfurls. And I think a lot of right now about John Dewey's reminder. He was writing in 1919 after the First World War and before the Second World War, where he said that democracy must be born again in every generation, and that education is its midwife. And I just sit and think about that. What does it mean for us to be midwives of democracy? What does it mean for us to be architects of creative futures? What does it mean for us to sit in collective spaces right now to imagine the world as it unfurls? And we have a choice. We have a choice to respond to the world with despair or disdain or cynicism, but we also have a choice to respond with hope. And my favorite definition of hope is challenging the actual in the name of the possible. So I love, Jim, that you can sort of hear me be clear-eyed and candid about the world around us. We have to look at what is actual. We cannot look away. We must have a steady gaze. We have to look at some of the uncomfortable truths around us and our complicity with these systems and structures. We have to look at what the actual is. And then we have to have the imaginative capacity to understand and to birth or to attend to midwife what else is possible. And I think we're at this critical moment, and it feels big and it feels overwhelming, and it feels like, how can I, as a small, tiny little human in this big, vast world, make a difference? And I think that's the key, is we have to figure out the tools necessary so that we are agentic in our own context, in our own spaces, in our own encounters, that we understand ourselves as stewards, as midwives, as architects of the future as it unfolds in front of us. So when Jim and Nicola and I were sort of talking about, well, what does that look like in practice? What would be useful for these folks? We landed on this topic of gathering. We landed on this topic of how do we gather in spaces, virtual and in person, in order to transform together, in order to harness the civic imagination necessary to move towards the possible. And I think what COVID did for me was bring into real stark relief the importance of gathering, the importance of getting into rooms, getting into Zooms, getting into spaces where we look at the whites of each other's eyes. We recognize each other's common humanity. We honor each other's self-determination and sovereignty, and then sit together with a willingness to transform, with a commitment to listening, not just to respond, but to be changed, to be elevated, to be persuaded to think differently, to hold up our assumptions, our perspectives to the light with grace. Jim and I were joking a little earlier about Brené Brown's notion of the word rumble. I love her use of rumble. When I first encountered it, I'm a child of the 70s and 80s, so I immediately thought, WWF, haymakers and Hulk Hogan, right? Are you ready to rumble? But Brené Brown reframes it for us, and she gives us this space where she says that if you can rumble, you can get into a space and you can say, I'm going to hold this lightly. And whatever this is, it can be a perspective, an opinion, an assumption, a topic, an idea. And it's an invitation. If you say, I'd like to rumble, for Brené Brown and for me, it's an invitation to hold the concept lightly, but your values firmly. And if you sit in curiosity long enough and with the epistemic humility of saying, I'm not too sure I'm right, or I'm not too sure I think this anymore, and in fact, I'm not too sure that opinion serves me anymore, you can get into these spaces where you can pull these ideas apart and put them back together. It's a way of deliberating across difference that is not antagonistic. It is generous, that it is not about debate, which is kind of entrenched. You're protecting and defending something, that you're sitting in the space, in the field of the other, willing to imagine something else is possible. And it requires us to do that, to sit in the discomfort, to be vulnerable, to take a risk, to imagine that we can exercise the epistemic humility necessary. And I think that's where, for me, I work in the higher education sector, that we haven't done a great job of doing. And I, in fact, have had to hold my own pedagogy lightly and examine it. I used to, as a junior faculty member, get my students to come in and to debate. Like, all right, this side of the class, is pro Satan and Paradise Lost, and this side of the class is pro Eve and Paradise Lost. Go, defend your person. And they would have these wonderful rhetorical arguments and defenses, and they would, dismantle each other's points, systematically and beautifully. They would argue forcefully, but it wasn't getting us to a place of shared understanding as much as it was shoring up an argument. And I had to really sit with a kind of reckoning once I saw it and thought, I'm teaching my students to engage in behavior that I found dismembering when I was in graduate school. That I found, I thought grad school was taking an idea, bringing it to a seminar, workshopping it, playing with it, pulling apart, adding to it, building a kind of shared vocabulary, and advancing the thinking. And my experience was getting, eviscerated and pulled apart and dismantled and deconstructed. And I thought, am I teaching my students how I was taught? Am I reproducing the ways of engaging that are not serving us anymore? What would it look like to gather in not a post-critical world, but maybe a post-critique world where we instead spend time doing yes and, building and illuminating, adding, transforming, stretching the fields of the horizons of what we know and how we know it, right? Even the epistemologies of how we sense make together. Can we do it differently? So I've been holding my own pedagogy lightly and playing with it and really trying to treat my classroom as a kind of microcosm of a creative democracy, that classroom can be a space for a rehearsal space for creative futures, right? Where we can try a bunch of different things out. That it is a incubator for a civic imagination. How do we imagine better together? Not just as individuals for imagination, but as collectively for the public good with civic imagination. How do we create incubators where we can exercise those muscles? And then that third provocation is, can my classroom and can higher education more broadly be a playground for courageous becoming? And courageous becoming treats identity not as fixed, not as static, not as something that you are, but something that you are always in the process of becoming. And courageous becoming really sits with courage, not cognitively, not with this sort of audacity or, precociousness, although that's fun. That courage tied to that old French word cœur, which is heart, right? That courage is heart. So what does it mean to center courageous becoming? Those are big asks, right? For a classroom, for a university, for a college, for an organization, for a society, to be a rehearsal space for creative futures, to be an incubator of a civic imagination, and to be a playground for courageous becoming. How do you do it? How do you design for it? What does it look like in practice? And so I've been spending a lot of time thinking about gathering. And thinking about gathering in spaces together with intention, with design, and with those principles in mind. How do you actually anchor that in practice? And I just like, with deep curiosity, an invitation for you to think about why you are gathering right now. Why are we gathering together? You have it in the busyness of business. We do not live in time affluence. We are exhausted, often running from one thing to another. But you have slowed down and paused and spent time together in intentional community. There are 214 of us, 215 of us in real time, that this ecosystem is living. You saw an invitation for yourself that you belonged to the conversation and that your presence matters. And I'm really curious about why you gather. Why are you here? And I'd love or invite you and encourage you to reflect on that and to put that into the chat if you feel comfortable with enthusiastic prior and informed consent. But just really curious about how you saw an invitation to this, what spoke to you, and what you hope to get from gathering. What do you see as valuable for your time, which is, often in constraint? So just as you were thinking about it and reflecting on it, I'd like to share Priya Parker's notion of the 4 main reasons to gather. She published her book, The Art of Gathering, which came out just a few months after COVID lockdown, which I found quite beautiful, that as we stopped gathering in regular normative spaces and we weren't able to gather in the kinds of rituals and rhythms that we were used to, this book came out as a kind of guide for gathering. And she suggests that there are 4 major sort of purposes for gathering. She says that we gather to connect, so to build community, to see each other, to be in spaces together. That's the first one. The second one is to decide. So that's often in deliberative spaces where we have to make a decision on a future policy, we have to make a resource allocation decision, we have to do a strategic plan, or we just have to decide on, the parking committee. She's always my excuse for any committee that I don't want to sit on is the parking committee, and yet it's one of the most important things in a university ecosystem. But you have to decide, right? So you have to make decisions about things. So the first one is to connect. The second one is to decide. The third one is to learn, right? To learn something differently, to add to your knowledge set, to build new conceptual tools or frameworks, to learn a new operating system, whatever it is, it's to learn something. That's the third. And the fourth is to transform, to change how you are in the world, to change how you show up, to change how you think about the world epistemologically, ontologically, spiritually, and embody different kinds of ways, any kind of transformation. So those 4 major purposes of gathering, sometimes there are more than one in a gathering. I would hope when I create conditions in my classroom, but also as I convene Hope Circuit summits and retreats and rumbles, that we are connecting with one another. Right? We gather to connect. We gather to learn in curiosity, right? With that epistemic humility. And then ideally that together in the process of curiosity and deep listening, that we can transform, that we leave the room, we leave the classroom, we leave the retreat, we leave the conference slightly changed. And I remember when I was an undergraduate, I had a really nonlinear track. I dropped out, I came back to university. And when I came back and I found that I belonged in the classroom, I would leave the classroom and it would feel like I had fireworks going off in my brain. I knew that I was a different person from when I walked into the classroom. And I feel very emotional about that. Thank you for holding that space, because wow, that wonder, that awe, that curiosity, that transformation didn't feel cognitive for me. It felt embodied. It felt illuminating. And I think that's what called me to this work in education. And it calls so many of you in your purpose work, when you are illuminated, when you are purposeful, when you are stepping into your purpose, you're flourishing, right? You're serving not just your own interests, but in collective good. You're serving something bigger and greater than yourself. So in those kinds of ways of gathering, to connect, to decide, to learn, and to transform, there are many different ways, and I cannot read and talk at the same time, but I love that some people are like, yeah, to learn, to transform, to connect to the mycelium network of others. Oh, the friendly fungi, right? Lighting up those interconnections of ecology in the soil that make the trees grow beautifully. I love mushrooms and mycelium. Thank you, Chris, for sharing that. And birthing a life-giving future. Thank you for coming back to that midwife language. And that midwife language is one of, my 11-year-old just turned 11 the end of March. And I was thinking about his arrival into the world, which was expected, but still a surprise. It was messy and beautiful and violent and painful and a relief. And he came into the world as I was belly laughing because I told a joke to the midwife. I had a very good epidural at the time. But if we are the midwives of democracy, the pains that we are experiencing, that Mark Carney calls rupture, are not catastrophic, right? They can be labor pains. They're not death pains. We have to bear down on this work right now. We have to sit in attentiveness and create the conditions where folks can show up in spaces where this is hard and messy and difficult and fraught. And yet we have this moment, we have this portal that we're walking through. Democracy is being born again every generation. This is the moment of rupture and emergence. And how do we hold that space for folks to show up, to be vulnerable, to be risky, to say the quiet things out loud? How do we gather? And I think there's a couple of things I'd love to share. I have a sort of practical handout that I'm really happy to share with the Center of Flourishing that can disseminate to the participation list if there's interest. But I've thought a lot about how do we design for this? How do we design for people to show up and gather so that they can flourish, that they can tap into their purpose, that they can feel seen, that they feel that there are two conditions of gathering that we are really intentional and attentive about? That people feel that they belong to the conversation and that their contributions and their presence matters. And we know this with a lot of research about high-performing teams. The highest performing teams, given complex tasks, are diverse. The more diverse the team, the higher they are performing if there are two conditions: that people feel they belong to the work, to the community, to the conversation, and their contributions matter and shape it, that it would be different or impoverished if they didn't show up. So how do you create the conditions of mattering and belonging where people feel heard, seen, and there's an ethics of care? And that they can show up differently. I love that Jim's question at the beginning is what happens when people get stuck in these systems, right? We get stuck in these ruts, in these broken systems, and we risk perpetuating the conditions we seek to upend because of the kind of intractability, the change resistance of the systems, and also the fact that we've internalized these systems and reproduce them, right? We're participating in it. How do we get unstuck? I think one of the interventions is we gather, and we gather with this intention where we invite people in, messy, emergent, three-dimensional, human, that folks will come in sometimes armored, and we give an invitation for people to loosen their armor or to leave their armor at the door to show up differently. So I'm going to share a couple of examples of how I design everything, every ecosystem that I'm lucky enough to be part of and to facilitate. I use this guide for gathering for my classrooms, for boardrooms, for resource allocation, for strategic visioning, for workshops, for retreats. I take boards of governors on retreats. I take senior leadership on retreat. I take faculties and divisions on retreat. I also take school boards and organizations on retreat. And I use the same design principles across the board. So I'll give you a sneak peek, and I'm happy to share this with you after the session. I'm going to share my screen. And I'm going to show you the guide for gathering. Can you confirm that you can see my screen and not my, yeah, perfect. Thank you. What I love about gathering and what I use all of the time is consent. Enthusiastic, ongoing, prior and informed consent. That people feel that they can say things, that they will not be quoted or cited, that they can hold things lightly, that they can change their mind, that you can withdraw consent at any time. And so I always seek out enthusiastic, prior, and informed consent because I think it's really important. And we cannot assume consent. I had a university president, he used to facilitate a board meeting when he would say, "I will take your silence as consent." And I thought, no, just go to the women's bathroom on the back of the toilet stand about consent to know that silence is not consent. It is enthusiastic, prior, informed, and ongoing, and you can withdraw it at any time. So in a guide for gathering, making sure that there is consent is really important as an opening design principle. I will often use Chatham House rules. That is something that political and press agreements come out where you can have a big rumbly conversation without being cited directly, that you can take your lessons out into the world, but you don't cite a particular person. And that allows people to show up a little bit looser. Chatham House rules also invites people to show up and to represent their own opinions, not an institution, not a discipline, but just them, their lived experience, intersectionality, and disciplinary lenses. So that really is important. Consent is key, and it's ongoing, and you have to check in all of the time. One of the things I love about gathering is enhancing presencing and just really marking how special it is to gather. That the 214 people in this room have never gathered before in the same time, in the same space, and will never gather again in the same permutation. That this moment, this ephemeral moment, is special. And I say this to my students when I teach the first 1,000 years of literature. I've taught it every year, every fall for 20 years, and it's different every time because it is special and ephemeral, because the people are different. And just being attentive to that present moment and understanding that it is special, that our time together is special, changes the quality of gathering. Without as many devices and distractions and all of the things. One of the principles that I've taken from improv is the yes and. And I do this and even I do it with, senior leaders. I take them on retreat and we have a swear jar where we put in the middle of the table and it's candies or whatever. But anytime somebody says no or but, they have to put something in the swear jar. And the invitation is to replace the no but with the yes and. Because in improv, if anyone does improv, if you say no or but, the world that you're creating, that you're improvising together, ends. That the yes and continues the world, continues the universe. And so that yes and allows us to sit in curiosity. Even if you vigorously disagree, Jim says something, I'm like, Jim, can I just do a yes and? And then Jim will be like, yes, okay. And that is so much more generous than being like, Jim, I deeply disagree. I don't think that AI is inventive. I think it's predictive. I think Jim and I would probably agree on that. But to do yes and creates a space that is post-critical or post-critique and gets us into openness. One of the things that I loved taking a group on retreat several months ago now that rearranged the furniture in my brain is one of the deans. We were in a senior leadership retreat, and one of the deans said, I wonder if we could loosen our assumptions of each other. Because we've been working in broken systems, we've been working in scarcity and deficit and crisis, and not all of us have shown up as our best selves in broken systems. Could we loosen our assumptions of one another and press not a reset button, but just a loosening and an opening of radical kindness? And I just thought, my goodness, first of all, that was so brave and so vulnerable for her to say that out loud. But you could see people's shoulders drop in the room. You could see people reflect on, wow, maybe I am not shown up as my best self in broken systems in the midst of crisis. Could I give grace to myself and give grace to others who we might have been in conflict with or disagreed about something pretty fundamental? So that exercising radical kindness really helped me give me language for the ways in which we have to figure out how to deliberate across difference. This is the rumble. Hold your opinions lightly and your values firmly. I do this all the time with research partners, with project partners, with students, where I'll say something and I'm like, can I just hold this lightly? Can I just say this out loud? Because I'm not sure I still believe this, or I'm not sure I have a really strong opinion, or I'm not sure I've got all of the information. Can I hold it lightly and invite us to take it apart and put it back together? And that often gets us into really beautiful, generous, and generative spaces rather than I need to be the smartest person in the room, or I need to have an answer, or I need to get it right, or I need to be right. Brené Brown revises us and says, don't be right. Commit to try to get it right. And I love that sort of invitation and opening. In any gathering, being mindful of power dynamics. When I invite, a university-wide Hope Summit. I just did a 500-person Hope Summit in Toronto. There are different people in the room from different authority positions, power positions, to invite everyone to show up brave, messy, imperfect, three-dimensional, without being attentive to power dynamics is unethical. Really being attentive to, okay, you can speak. Can you speak freely in this space? If you can't, maybe don't show up loose, messy, and emergent. Really look at those power dynamics. And if we are willing to sit in those spaces, then we have to commit to understanding how power is shaping relationships, structures, behaviors, and assumptions. In any of my unfurling and workshops, I embrace nonlinearity. So much more about process now than product. I used to come up with learning outcomes, or with Senate objectives and products, and we must have a policy by the end of this meeting, right? I would create these sort of goals, and it would be product based, so it would be much more transactional and instrumentalized. Now, when I take folks into these spaces, we really start with process, and we sit in non-linearity. We don't immediately sort of leap to what's next. And yet, when we stay with process, inevitably and unfailingly, product happens. People pop up with things. This is where we could do this. This is where we could do this. Here's how we could intervene. Here's how we adopt a consent agenda. Here's how we create governance literacy. Products happen when you sit with process, and they're often more interesting, nuanced, and shared because it's co-created in the gathering. One of the things that I have borrowed from some of my beautiful, community change leads like Gabriel Donnelly is using words like I notice or I wonder. Instead of I think or we should or, you said, it changes the dynamic. It's very small. It's a tiny, tiny language shift. But to start with, I notice, that you said this, or I notice that this conversation keeps coming up, and I wonder about this, changes the center of gravity. It sits in curiosity with a willingness to be a learner and to transform. One of the things that when I started the Hope Circuits work 2 years ago and just started to say yes to invitations and ecosystems across Canada and the US and now around the world, is I didn't really realize how big feelings would come up, how feelings would emerge. I had this one experience where I took a group of 50 on retreat for the day, and I had what I thought was a very simple opening, which is a think, pair, share about what do you love about the university that you're at? What do you love? And at the end of the day, I had this sort of older, very senior administrator chase me into a parking lot. And he looked at me and he collapsed into tears. And he said, "Thank you so much. I have never been asked in my 40 years at the institution what I love about it. And I've never been able to share it with my colleagues. And I got to say it out loud, and I got to listen to what other folks love about this community, about this ecosystem. And it was transformative." And he just sort of wept in my arms. And I thought, oh, wow, we, especially in the academy, are so highly developed in our brains that we sort of feel dismembered from our feelings. And yet that's the way forward. That's how we live in kind of embodied, present gathering right now. That's how we really focus on radical humanization, is making space for big feelings. And then my final design principle, which is a very simple one, and it's one I have to remind myself of all of the time, is to be curious about language, about the language we use all of the time, because it doesn't just mirror our reality, it shapes it. When I get tired, when I get despairing, and I do it all, I've written lots of books about hope because my default is despair. My default is hiding under the covers and howling into the abyss. I have to work intentionally to get into hope as practice, hope as a verb. And so when I get tired, I find myself falling into monolithic language of us versus them. I say the university or the administration or the students or the faculty or, and insert that into society, the liberals, the conservatives. We do this language of monolith and erase all of the differences, all of the beautiful intersectionalities and disciplinary differences and lived experience. And so when I do that, when I get tired, I have to come back to curiosity and sit with, why am I using the monolithic language? Can I get granular? Can I get local? And it took me about 4 books writing about hope to realize something very simple, which is when despair feels monolithic, hope gets local. Hope gets into conversation. Hope gets proximate. Hope gets into curiosity and says, maybe we just be attentive to the language that we're using. Even the idioms are so violent, killing 2 birds with 1 stone. Once I heard it, I realized this is not a great idiom to use about killing birds. Well, that's efficiency and productivity. What? All of that language, if we're curious about the language we use and the language that we're using to shape our world, then we can get into spaces where people don't have to be right away, but can sit in that messy unfurling and deliberate across difference. And so those are some guides, some design principles, some things that I have used in my own practice that I have gathered from beautiful facilitators and thinkers who have taught me to sit in circle in curiosity, to move away from the podium as a colonial construct, to sit in wonder and awe, to model vulnerability and messiness, to sit in the vividness of this moment, and to metabolize in collective sense making. And so those design principles have helped me shape spaces for those 3 provocations to maybe come into being. So that the spaces that I try to gather are incubators of civic imagination, rehearsal spaces for creative futures, and playgrounds for courageous becoming. And I hope that some of those tweaks, those tools, those principles are helpful to you in your own facilitation, in your own gathering. The next time you go to a meeting, you can ask at the beginning, what's our purpose? Are we here to connect, to decide, to learn, to transform? How are we inviting people into this space? How are we making sure that those conditions of belonging and mattering are there, that we are anchoring it in practice in all of the ways that we show up together? Because I think it matters now more than ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. Phenomenal. I've collected 4 questions already that have come up. And if you have time for them, we can go through them. I also invite people in the chat to share their questions. We most likely won't have time to cover them all. We are realistically going to stay over for 5 minutes or so. Yet, your questions matter. We would love to hear them, and then maybe there are going to be many ways to answer them in some way. So I'll start ahead with what I already have. It is interesting how quote gathering can feel very different if it is based on one-on-one connections versus larger group dynamics. I appreciate learning from different perspectives, but this works best in more personal interactions where it is easy to ask questions, listen, and reflect according to the person pointing this out.
Oh, I love that. Yeah. And I think one of the questions that I'm living into is how do we scale that, right? That relational piece is so important that people feel that they are seen, that they matter, they belong, that you can have a conversation with an intention to transform. And my question is how can we scale that? How can we actually create, like I did a 500-person Hope Summit, and that was one of the questions is can we create the conditions where people feel still a one size fits one model, that they matter, that they're not just a number. And I love Taylor Swift. I'm just going to bring in Taylor Swift right now because she does concerts where 50,000 people go into an auditorium and feel that they matter and belong. They do bracelets, they dress up, they take themes, they have conversations in the bathroom lineups. There is deep community in large gatherings. And yet every person I've talked to who goes to a concert of Taylor Swift, I have not gone yet, is they feel like she is singing directly to them. So how do we do it the Taylor Swift effect, where we gather in collective and communal spaces where we feel that we are part of something larger than ourselves, that we matter and belong, and we also feel like we're being sung to as individual selves? And I think that's a question that I'm living into. And if you have any ideas, please put them in the chat or connect with me, because I think that's a question that we can ask about design. It's happening. It's happening in pop culture. How do we do it in our other social institutions that are serving public good?
Somebody says enthusiastic consent might be too high a bar, as it can exclude those who are reluctant yet still come to the table.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. I just, I have a new book that's out for peer review right now called Hope Circuits Illuminated: Conversations with Luminaries Amid Collapse. And it's these 50 beautiful luminaries from across the sector who write these gorgeous, say the quiet things out loud, little essays, and I weave them together in conversation. And I dedicated the book to the nopers and the anti-hopers, the folks who feel really strongly that I don't wanna, or I'm not sure I can right now, or how is this any different than it used to be? And I think that we need to meet those people. That's in the field of the other. We have to be able to do that, to sit in those spaces and to recognize that people are suspicious. Distrust is armor to survive in systems that are full of structural and relational violence. And I have to treat that armor with real respect and grace. I had one person say to me, "Thank you very much for inviting me to be full, messy, and emergent, but I really like my armor. I've worked really hard on my armor for like 20 years. I've bedazzled my armor." And she said, "When you asked me to put down my armor, it feels really uncomfortable." And I thought, oh, she did it with such joy and laughter, but we had a big belly laugh about, like, yeah, sometimes we've bedazzled that. That is data for working within broken systems, and giving people grace to not be ready, or at least not to be ready right now, is to understand that those systems also need to be renewed and rewired to center flourishing, not just resilience, right? Resilience is managing better in deteriorating conditions, and flourishing is tapping into purpose, not just as individuals, but collectively, for meaningful contributions to a better and more just world. So I love that. I don't wanna, or enthusiastic consent. My enthusiasm might be tepid for a while. I'm here for all of that.
Somebody says showing up costs so much.
Yeah.
Divergent people seem to be shouldering most of the belonging or communication burden. We are often lured into, quote, safe spaces only to experience further ostracization. I come in hope, but not unmasked or vulnerable.
Yeah. Love that comment. Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that, I have to make real intentional effort about is to, when I gather folks in these ways, recognizing that different kinds of power show up in the room, that there have been structural violence, relational violence, lateral violence, that the systems in place and the perpetrators of them are sometimes in the room, to really attentive to building trust, but also managing it. Sometimes just listen, poke your toe out. Hypervigilance is also a survival technique in really difficult and fraught situations. So I think that's a really important point to keep in mind. And I think that armor, back to the bedazzled armor, it's there for a reason. It's there for survival. And I do think that I have the benefit of gathering folks in sort of academic adjacent spaces, getting people out of their sort of regular ruts and into spaces where we can imagine being in relationship differently. I hold that as a deep privilege and a responsibility, but I'm also attentive to mitigating harm and reducing suffering.
This is where I suggest we wrap up for today. Thank you again immensely, Jessica.
Thank you so much, everybody. What a pleasure to be in conversation and community. I'm going to try to, Nicola, if you could send me the chat, I would love. I did not have a chance to sort of read because I can't read and talk. I learned that lesson in COVID. So if you could send that to me, and I will read with great pleasure. And my email address, if anyone is interested in continuing the conversation, I'm a research chair and curious learner. So if anything tweaked for you, if you use design principles, if you gather differently, if you're imagining the world in these spaces as ecosystems, please send me an email. Please connect. I am always sitting as a learner and always writing the next book, trying to bring in and amplify different kinds of voices. So please do connect.
Fabulous. Reminder, please support this work, the series and the center. There is a easy way to donate with a button on our website, and we invite you to our next talk, which goes right at the core of everything we talked about today. Title is The Power and Practice of Presence, led by Senior Kripalu teacher Aruninan Futuronsky. April 30th, 12 p.m. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.